So hello everybody, welcome to this webinar. My name is Luc Gerardin. I'm taking care of the Europe chapter for Columbia Venture Community. I'm also taking care of some part of the digital business at Cognizant. So yeah, welcome, great to have everybody. So today we're going to talk about how the startup ecosystem is going to evolve, and how we see it evolving. From different perspectives. The first one is basically how it's evolving in time based on the recent drivers, one of them having been COVID, this large event, large crisis that the whole economy has been facing. And we are going to look from our point of view where actually this has been impacting the venture ecosystem. The other one is the Biden administration, who now coming in power in the US. Obviously, we expect a lot of turnaround, like it's been in a lot of other topics around the regulation and legislation around startup. Given that this administration is looking to probably going to be very friendly to startup, and we have actually two panelists who are close to who have insiders somehow from this administration. So it would be great to benefit actually from their view. Yeah, and so basically our objective is really to try to give you a sense on what is upcoming, for the startup community right now at this very particular time, where we are slowly coming out of a very significant crisis, and we have also a new political momentum. Yeah, we're going to try to find a crystal ball or see where we see things happen. And hopefully that will help you either as an investor or as a founder or even as an observer or as a member of the community to understand actually what is going on and what are the right actions for you to take at this stage. So for that, we have two distinguished panelists who have very kindly accepted to join this conversation. First one is Jared Davis and Dana Kolaruli. So thank you very much for accepting this invitation. Maybe I'll give you the words to briefly introduce yourself and let us know where you come from and what is your background.
Sure. I defer to Jared to go ahead first.
Thanks, Dana. You get the first question because of that.
Oh, great.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jared Davis. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm actually based out of Miami, Florida, United States, and I wear sort of two hats. One is I'm the co-managing partner of the Miami office of Greenberg Traurig and a member of their executive committee. We're an international law firm, about 2,300 lawyers, 41 offices globally across the world. My practice, the other hat I wear is I am a corporate practitioner, M&A, private equity, venture capital, but also both on a civic basis as well as a practice basis. I do have a robust startup practice as well. Like I said, it's part civic, part practice, because I do believe that that's the silver bullet innovation. So I've actually traveled around the world, Norway, Montreal, et cetera, helping to set up ecosystems and talk to some of the major players out there. So this is something that's near and dear to my heart. I think you guys do God's work, quite frankly. But here just to talk about where we see 2021 going, and excited to be here.
Thank you, Jared.
And I'll introduce myself. I'm Dana Kolaruli. Like Jared, I wear a few different hats. I'm the executive director of the Licensing Executive Society International, which is an umbrella organization, about 33 independent societies in 90 different countries, about 75 to 8,000 members who are all licensed professionals, either in companies or out on the street, helping companies, helping startups. It's been an interesting journey over the last year. I joined the organization just a couple months before COVID hit. So we've transformed the organization from a traditionally organization that gathers people. There's a big emphasis on getting together and just getting to know professionals, building those relationships so you can then move into kind of a deal making. And we've made all that virtual, so it's been fun and challenging. And now we're doing a 24-hour meeting in May, literally starting at 7 a.m. in the East Coast and ending at 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. On the East Coast the next day. So I'm happy to talk more about that and what we're planning for that. But it's been an interesting challenge. The second hat, one of the second hats I wear is I'm based here in Washington, D.C. For the last 10 years or so, until about a year ago, I was the Director of Government Affairs at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. So through two very different administrations, about 3 directors of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. So the hat I wear today to keep me in tune with that world is I also am a partner at a consulting firm in D.C., the American Continental Group. And generally joined some professionals that I've been working with for most of my career in one way or another, supporting clients with their IP interests. So whether that's helping to navigate Capitol Hill or just weighing in on some of the policy issues around IP. Certainly patent eligibility, I've spent quite a bit of time on the last few years. A lot of interest in other issues right now with the new administration. So helping on a whole sort of issues there. I'll mention one last one that I do, because I agree with Jared. I think one of our responsibilities as professionals is trying to kind of build the infrastructure and be a resource, just to make sure that people can navigate the system. So that social aspect. I'm also a board member of the US IPA, the US Intellectual Property Alliance, which is a new organization that's kind of a organization of organizations and practitioners, all focused on building the local ecosystem. So if you don't know where to turn to for certain resources, there should be an easy way to find it, an easy way to kind of find out whether you need education, assistance, funding. So, focusing on how to make those resources more available is the goal of that organization. So I stay busy.
Looks like, absolutely.
Yeah.
Always a good thing. So thank you both. I'm actually supported also on this panel by Peter Ling and Tudor Velea from the European Chapter of Columbia Venture Community, who have helped me a lot build this panel. So yeah, actually, if you are an alumni from Columbia based in Europe and you wish to join this chapter, feel free to reach out, and we'll be very happy to have a conversation on how we can work together. So jumping into the conversation, the first topic we want to look at is a little bit where we are, taking a bit the pulse right now in terms of what are the current practices in terms of deal making, on how is that evolving. So the first question I had was around what is driving deals in 2021. Obviously the agenda has been shifting a lot. I see it also in my business where the digital agenda typically has been strongly accelerated. Things like cloud, things like AI, that was, at least for AI, a little bit sleepy topics, are now really awakening. Things like digital workplace, people have to be able to work from anywhere. All these things are really coming up. So there has been, I think, a shift in terms of topics, agenda, and so on. How do you see that? Do you see that in terms of the deal you cover, or do you have any view on what is now upcoming at the exit of this crisis?
Well, I can start, Jared. You jump in. I think we've been focusing quite a bit on the COVID impact on the deal making process, right? So everything from not just the technology making meetings that you can't otherwise have in person, maybe even more efficient, so that by the time you sit down at the table to decide whether the deal is going to be done, there may be a number of small meetings at all different time zones that could happen in those months leading up, or those weeks leading up. And in fact, the timeline for those types of conversations has been reduced. So in some ways, we really are realizing a little bit of an efficiency of being more virtual versus more in person. That's certainly an impact. I think around that comes a lot of etiquette. and his best practices around etiquette in terms of introducing and making those connections. It is a little harder in some ways to build a bond, even though you can have more frequent contact or contact with different people within an organization. So how do you overcome those types of things? There's a number of folks in my organization that have been, we have a number of younger professionals that are looking to build a network, and a lot of folks have been around for a while. Folks have been around for a while, often would say, no deal without a meal. Well, that situation has now changed, but there certainly is other ways to kind of build that that type of relationship. So I think as we move forward and the world becomes a little bit more certain, we'll still retain a lot of that. I think you get to the hybrid negotiations, which again might have those efficiencies. So I think the process of the deal making is one of the things we've been focused on. Clearly, and then clearly by industry, the big drivers of a lot of this innovation, one has been COVID response. So certainly in the life sciences area, we've had, not what I already described as kind of a shortened time frame for deals, but partners that you might not have otherwise thought of before. It all coming together in order to respond, to build capacity that they could not build on their own, but create these partnerships to get things to doctors, to get shots in arms, to get solutions to the marketplace to serve those dire needs. So I think that's been one of the biggest drivers in the life sciences area. But otherwise, even before COVID, we saw lots of convergence of technology. So I think the COVID impacts I'm describing hit at a very particular time where you have other technologies that are also coming together. That certainly has an impact on how you protect, but it also has an impact on who you deal with and who you collaborate with. So I think those are the issues that I think we've been focused on and try to talk about within LES.
I agree 100% with that. I guess I'll break it up into two buckets. The first one being how COVID has affected deal making, and I 100% agree with Dana. In some ways, when it comes to the whole virtual deal making, we were on track for this for a number of years. Even before COVID, a good number of my deals were always virtual. A lot of it tended to turn on cultural preferences and cultural preferences of a particular industry. So for instance, historically, and even now, I've noticed my heavy industrials clients, interestingly enough, with telemedicine, my healthcare clients and my banking clients seem to want to, where possible, still meet in person. But tech clients obviously always were in a virtual environment. That was where they thrived. Founder-owned businesses, many times you always get sort of the stereotypical founder who may be a true operator type, who, if at all possible, can try and go away from the virtual landscape, but they're doing it, even them. What we have found is, and what I've said multiple times, there's actually a Business Insider article where I've talked about this. I think just as COVID showed us that from a functionality point of view, remote deal making works, to some extent it also highlighted 100% that it's not 100% optimal. There is that loss of connectivity. There is that loss of the intangible of reading the room during a negotiation. And so the prediction I've been making to people is that when we're back to a full post-COVID mode, there'll probably be a hybrid approach. I don't think, we know how deals get done. There's 1 billion and one calls where, dealing with little things, minute things, diligence, things like that, those will always be virtual. But for the large heavy hitter calls or meetings, so for instance, a great example would be the kickoff meeting where you kick off a deal. I think we're going to go back to those being in person because you really have to. That initial meeting is so important in terms of setting tone and in terms of setting the dynamic that I think we're going to still have physical kickoff meetings. So I think that's where we are on that. In terms of, sort of predicting the future, where we are and how COVID impacted that, I'm going to talk more from an investment point of view than anything. But you have to remember there's still a ton of undeployed capital, what we call dry powder. In January 2020, when we first started this COVID journey, there was a ton of dry powder. There was $1.5 trillion to be exact. January 2021, where we kicked off this year, it's still at about 1 trillion. So we all know the dynamic. Those of you who know how institutional investors work, how venture funds work, private equity funds work, if the capital isn't deployed within the prescribed investment period, it has to be returned. And obviously that seems unacceptable. You're giving up carry, you're giving up management fees. And so the institutional investor community is going to make sure these deals get done. You know, as lawyers, we used to always joke, we'll always eat because the investment bankers will always find a way to make the deal happen. It's the same thing with the institutional investors. And so as a consequence, what we're seeing is higher and higher checks being cut, whether at the venture level or the PE level. And this led to not a new phenomenon, but this led to an interesting phenomenon called the SPAC phenomenon. And I'm sure many of you have been hearing about these SPACs, special purpose acquisition companies, which are really just another way of taking a private company public. But we're starting to see a tremendous amount of deal flow there. And again, it's the exact same phenomenon, which is you've got a tremendous amount of undeployed capital. In the private markets, it's pretty much been saturated, although we're still seeing valuations that are astronomical. People are starting to wake up again about the public capital markets. And historically, people stayed away from the public capital markets because the traditional IPO process is heavily inefficient. And by the way, even the chair of the SEC has gone on record of saying that the traditional IPO process is broken. And so with SPACs and direct listings and all these exotic tools we're starting to see come about, we're starting to see a return to the public capital markets, which is fascinating to me because it opens up the entire world for startups. And so you're going to start to see more and more European startups availing themselves of it, more and more American startups doing that. I'm happy to go into detail on that. It can go pretty deep, but I think that's where you're starting to see some interesting activity. In terms of from an industry point of view, on the biotech pharma side, you're starting to see the similar activity to last year, but it's starting to still increase, particularly on the IPO side, as I mentioned, with SPACs and direct listings. You had Sana Biotech, which is a cell engineering platform. They went public at about a $6 billion valuation just last month. They're just a great example there. COVID helped out tremendously there because no one wants to miss out on the next Moderna. That's really what we're hearing out there. So when you see these astronomical valuations, the fact that there was a biotech out there that basically changed the world has people clamoring to get involved in that. On the fintech side, obviously COVID drove contactless technology. You can't have contact, obviously. So what that showed us is that from a functional point of view, it works, but now we're starting to roll it out for convenience. The National Retail Federation survey found that 19% of people made their first contactless payment in May, with 57% predicting that they continue to use it after the pandemic. So this opens up an entire different world of solutions there. Banking the unbanked. That's becoming huge. That was already becoming huge in 2019. It became bigger in 2020. 2021, it'll be even bigger. And it's not just on the individual level. A lot of times people think banking the unbanked means that it's individual. There's a civic aspect to it, access to financial services, which is wonderful, of course. But what people also forget is there's entire industries that can't be banked currently. Most notably cannabis and the pornography industry. Those are two industries that, for a variety of reasons, if you look at some of the OCC proclamations within the United States, those industries have always struggled in the United States from a banking point of view. Well, some of these fintech solutions that are coming out, the banking, the unbanked, are going to be huge in those industries. So any startup that wants to participate in those is automatically going to see a huge valuation pop. And then finally, you see the whole open banking initiative, which in Europe has been huge for a while, but in the United States, we're just now catching up. A system by which banks open up their APIs to fintechs and other third parties to develop new apps and services, and offering the banks an opportunity to partner with the fintechs as opposed to competing with them. And so, as from a regulatory point of view, and more importantly, a philosophical point of view, people are starting to adopt that. People are getting comfortable from a privacy point of view, a perspective of data security. You're going to see tremendous opportunities there. I mean, the dream is to basically have one open platform that sort of democratizes financial services. People have called it banking as a service for customers, just like with healthcare. Basically, the logic is that a banking customer or a healthcare customer truly gets ownership of their data, and that everything else is just a platform. And so these are just a few areas where COVID's really opened up opportunities, where the first stage was from a functional point of view, but then once we realized, hey, from a functionality point of view, it works, it then became, well, wait a minute, there's other applications, other conveniences this opens up. And so that leads to a lot of opportunities for startups in 2021.
Great, thank you very much.
I was just going to add the other thing, the thing that seems fascinating to me, Jared, is I think it also overcame some barriers. If folks are reticent to adopting the certain technology, now it's proven that it works. So just, whether that's on an everyday basis, I love my curbside pickup in my neighborhood. My restaurants have done a great job. Now they say, oh, well, this is easy. what else can we do? So I think that's right. The other thing I was going to point out, just maybe some data to go along with your prediction. Ocean Tomo put out a report earlier this year, and they published an article in our journal in Les Nouvelles, just talking about the impact of COVID in restraining potential dollars. That once we get through this, there's this incredible amount of tension that may release funds, that may initiate a lot more resources available particularly for innovative companies, because people have been sitting on the sidelines for a bit. I want nothing more than to see that. I think that would be great, and we may be at the precipice of that maybe in another few months here. Maybe starting it now.
I agree with that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I also hope that the long cycle of innovation will kind of finally trigger. The cycles that we've been seeing for 15, 20 years are hopefully not getting to maturity. And COVID is hopefully going to be the tipping point where we are going to see that at scale. Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much for these very insightful comments. The next point I wanted to look at is the Europe versus US perspective. I think the startup ecosystem in Europe versus US are relatively different. Europe being more publicly funded, they are actually extremely good funding system in early stage, where you can have public funds from the European Union, from a number of institutions inside countries like in France or Germany. You can even create your startup being paid unemployment money for like a year and a half. So at this stage, it's great. Meanwhile, in the US, obviously, the overall ecosystem, the private ecosystem is much stronger, and you can really get whatever you want. You have access to capital from VC, which is probably a bit easier. How do you see actually things evolving on that? Do you think the buffer that, let's say, the government can provide in Europe has been more effective than the let's say, privately managed system in the US?
Jared, I'll let you take that.
Part of the issue is it's always a philosophical divide, isn't it? Yeah. I have often argued that, and I've argued this at pretty high levels of the administration, that we should have either at a state level, like Florida, New York, Texas, or what have you, or at the national level, ideally, an office of the chief scientist. So if you go to certain countries like Israel, for instance, there is an office of the chief scientist. I think in any country that claims to be about innovation, you should have that position. But there is there's a philosophical belief in the United States that the government does not have should not have that much of a penetrative role when it comes to the ecosystem. Having said that, though, I do think there's opportunities. It won't be as overt as you see in Europe, or you see, say, Canada, for instance. I love Canada and Australia's R&D tax program. I mean, I think that credit program is amazing. But what we will see is, so for instance, you have what's been forecast by the administration is President Biden's going to have the Build Back Better plan. It hasn't been put out yet. It's anticipated he'll address a joint session of Congress in which he'll outline the proposal. It will be transformative, about $3 trillion of economic impact. And if you look at the buckets that supposedly will be earmarked for that, infrastructure by $1.3 trillion. So funding for roads, bridges, transit, aviation, water infrastructure, broadband, $600 billion for clean energy, electric car charging stations, electric grid upgrades, energy efficiency, carbon capture, $400 billion for manufacturing and workforce support. So manufacturing incentives by America, and that may have an interesting impact on our European friends. Minimum wage, paid leave. $300 billion for innovation and R&D, funding for breakthrough technologies like electric vehicles, 5G, AI, and then $700 billion for caregiver economy, healthcare workers, et cetera. The reason why this is significant is the Biden administration has forecasted that while they plan to make these substantial transformative investments, they don't believe in terms of the execution it's going to go through an agency. They have been very clear. They believe that it's innovation, startups, small, nimble companies that will probably execute on a number of these in terms of clean energy, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of obviously the innovation prong. And so while they won't establish, formal programs, or at least none that I've heard of, the plan by itself and the thought process and ethos behind how they see it coming to fruition means that it's going to be tremendous amount of support for the startup ecosystem, both domestically and abroad. I mean, obviously, they've sort of forecasted a lot of this is obviously somewhat protectionist. There's going to be somewhat support for American startups, but at the same time, let's say a European startup has a solution that's particularly compelling on the infrastructure side, something we just can't solve for. Then guess what? You're probably going to be able to benefit significantly from that money. Or, as is the case in the Australian, Canadian R&D tax credit, there are interesting structuring tricks you can do to deal with that. So let's say you decide to base your R&D operations out of the United States, even though you're an EU concern. You have a significant number of American employees. There's ways to structure. I can't tell you what they are yet because the package doesn't exist yet.
Right.
But many times with these packages, there are structuring ways where an EU startup can take advantage, even though it's being denoted as an American Plus program. So I think that's where you'll see a lot of opportunities for startups, even though philosophically, I've sort of given up on the United States having an overt program like you see in other countries. But I do think the tone of his plan that is the expectation that startups will be at the vanguard of it.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think that all makes sense to me as well. In the U.S. on the policy side, we have that, right, and I think you see the Office of Science and Technology and the White House trying to lead the policy discussion on what are the priorities. Where do we need to see the growth? And you've seen a lot of emphasis both from OSTP and from the White House on green tech. So they're setting the agenda of where they think and they hope that the innovation will go. But you're right, unlike Europe, there's not that direct funding except in small pockets, right? So if you can qualify for an SBIR grant, there is some funding there for very, very ultra smaller groups of companies, but not for the major technology. I mean, I think there was I'll emphasize this too, and I think there was a recent report that historically said that large companies don't innovate nearly as effective as small ones, right? So this is something that those of us who've advocated for small startups and small, more agile companies versus larger companies, that's really where the innovation can come. And I think that's just important to recognize, particularly in some of the other policy discussions that have been happening over the last few years. In the U.S. right now, we're focusing a lot on antitrust. What's that right balance between large tech and small tech? Do small tech have an ability to even bring their innovations to market with the likes of Amazon and Google and others, notwithstanding the fact that they've brought us a lot of things as well. So I think the antitrust part folks will be looking at significantly. There's a balance there too. I think particularly startups, and I think the venture community is concerned with over-aggressive antitrust enforcement in the U.S. because it makes all that M&A activity much more difficult. So there's a balance there to make sure that the market's working well. But as Jared points out, there's obvious differences between the European environment and here in the U.S. I mean, what's certainly true is that in all of these, the intellectual property, which I spend a lot of time on, is so critically important to be able to, whether you're messaging to future investors, trying to build a company, protecting those rights early, having certainty in those rights, having predictability in those rights. All of those things are incredibly important to helping innovative companies succeed. So, I think hopefully there'll be an emphasis continued on that. I think in the U.S. particularly, we have some more work to do just on the certainty of the legal rights to make sure that the legal rights are consistently predictable. But then, I think the administration can play a very strong role in helping us prioritize and draw people's interests towards those particular areas where we need to see private sector investment. We need to see more innovation to keep the U.S. competitive internationally. And I think when President Biden launches the plan, I think you'll hear a lot of that too. These are the things we need to do. These are the things that we, as the U.S., need to invest in to continue to be innovative and a leader.
One area that'd be interesting for me to see is where the administration goes in terms of incentives on where IP is housed. Because historically, when the Trump administration put out its tax package, there was sort of renewed incentives to house IP within the United States. As you know, it's always been popular to house in Ireland. Certain other places didn't license it out, and it's always interesting to see with each new administration what are the incentives and disincentives for where IP is housed? Because, you know, part of that, at least in my world, that's where the rubber hits the road. For a lot of investors, when I'm representing the money side, the VC side, the PE side, there is sometimes a preference I found for the IP to be housed within the United States. And we actually try and talk them out of it because we say, look, it's depending on how you structure it. If it's in Ireland or what have you, and then the license rights are done correctly, it's just the efficacy is just as strong. You know, don't give up a good deal just for that. But it's an interesting thing to keep in mind, particularly if you're an EU startup, that when you're dealing with U.S. funds, I hear it all the time. Like I said, I don't agree with it, but there is still this bias in favor of making sure the IP is housed. It's almost like the IP is a tangible asset as opposed to an intangible asset. We're a U.S. VC fund. The IP we invest in has to be in the United States. Like why? But I've seen that bias time and time again. So it's always interesting to see. One of the things I'm tracking with the Biden administration, as I did with the Trump administration, is what incentives and disincentives are there in terms of where IP is housed.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah, really interesting. So in terms of what you see upcoming from the Biden administration, how do you see, let's say, the top 5 measures that they would take for the startup ecosystem? I mean, you've been already discussing a little bit, but can you maybe summarize top 5, top 3, whatever you want?
Could try to do it like a high level. Number one, I will say is the Build Better, the Build Back Better plan. Saying it 3 times is hard because I do. It's like a alliteration.
It's like toy boat, right?
So that I'll just say that's one because that kind of economic impact and given where the buckets are, I do think that's going to drive activity. I think so how they're paying for the plan will be number 2, which is the increased corporate tax rate. Right now, I think it's looking to go from 21% to 28%. A new alternative minimum tax equal to 15% on booked income, a minimum tax of 21% on U.S. companies located overseas, which is 2 times the current rate. What does all that mean as that second bucket? It means that European companies are going to be more competitive in terms of where investors look to place money, because now the tax base goes up for these domestic companies, which will be interesting. So I'll put that as number 2. Number 3, I would say, is what you referenced before, which is the regulation of large tech companies in the United States. You know, we talked about antitrust, privacy, cybersecurity, Communication Decency Act, Section 230, which that grants internet platforms legal immunity from their content. That's supposed to be on the table. That could be very interesting. So any of that stuff. Number 4, I'll say, is anti-bias enforcement. There's some interesting stuff going on there when it comes to, well, first, let me explain the issue for those who don't understand. It has been shown pretty conclusively that in certain artificial intelligence packages, the biases of the developer are baked into the AI system. And so and when I say bias, racial bias, gender bias, et cetera. So while we believe that an AI package of all things should be able to look at the universe neutrally and not through that lens, so what was the old acronym, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out? If the developer who developed the AI package suffers from those biases, it's been shown, again, fairly conclusively, this part isn't a debate, it's how you address it, that's the debate, that these AI packages do suffer from bias as well. And so there's facial recognition, emotion analytics software packages that are going through the same thing. That has a consequence because of police surveillance. And where that affects European startups is if you're developing these packages, you have to be aware that there's a very good chance that within the next year, 2 or 3, we could see some significant legislation coming out to address that. And so you need to be ahead of the curve. Imagine the worst thing you could do is be developing a facial recognition software, emotion analytics software, AI software, and you're ready to go to market in the United States. You're so excited, your business plan factored in, a good 40% uptick in revenue. And then you find out because your packages suffer from this AI, from this bias issue, you won't be able to monetize it, or at least not at the level that you had projected. And so you need to really stay on top of this because it's being talked about a great deal. So I'll say that's number 3. Number 4 will be workers' rights. So you hear all the stuff about Uber, Lyft, the whole independent contractor issue that most rideshare companies, they're independent contractors, so they're not eligible for a great deal of benefits. The administration has mentioned multiple times that they're sympathetic to that. So you could see some interesting things coming out there. California tried unsuccessfully to pass legislation that would reclassify gig workers as full-time employees. Didn't work out, but obviously they're going to keep trying, especially at the national level. So I think that's going to be a massive one, because if that factors into your business model, that kind of a gig economy format, it changes the entire economic model for companies like that. So you just have to be aware. And then we're going to talk about ESG probably later, but I'll say all the ESG stuff that's coming out. So environmental, climate change, regs, the social governance items, things like that. That would be my top 5 without really thinking about it much.
It's a good list. Let me see if I can. So filling in, I guess, my gaps. I think I already mentioned. Well, let me start here in no particular order. I think not just startups, but overall the innovation community. I think the first focus for the Biden administration is seeing what leadership they put in place at some of these key these key positions. So certainly, my old haunt, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, having a director in place that is. Number one, a manager can manage a 13,000 person organization, $3.5 billion of funding to just keep the operation going. But then a good communicator, someone who can, not only communicate where the system needs to change to make sure that there's predictability and certainty, so that the rights that all of us rely on for investment and to drive innovation can be relied on. And then a good person that can advocate for the system. Frankly, what's the purpose of the system? Why should it be used, continued? What kind of international structures do we need to have? You need good leadership there at USPTO. But similarly, there's other positions that many of us are looking at the Department of Justice. The antitrust chief there is clearly very important. At the White House, the intellectual property enforcement coordinator, IPEC, which created a few cycles ago. We've had 3 so far. Making sure that we coordinate the various different resources kind of throughout government that are trying to help enforce rights. All those are incredibly important, and the administration's really at that point where they're just standing this up. I will say, I think it's interesting that there's a number of Biden administration nominees and now confirmed appointees that have some VC background, including I grew up in the state of Rhode Island, so my governor, Gina Raimondo, is now the Secretary of Commerce. She started her own VC fund, Boston-based VC fund, the Point Judith Capital. I think a few others as well have had that background. The Secretary of State, Ron Klain, the President's Chief of Staff, they all have a foot in the VC world. So I think that's good. I think that's good for us and good for keeping the conversation focused on, what do we need to do to make sure we're not only helping young companies develop, but actually we're funding them and being realistic. So I think that's generally a good trend. So, I think leadership and getting good people in good positions helps government work right, and make sure that we're asking all the right questions. I think so that's number one kind of on my list. The second I already kind of mentioned, I'm fascinated by the conversation about antitrust. I think it works both ways. I think that there's been a lot of concern on the efficient infringement side of patents, which has in some ways devalued or at least made the risk of investing in IP a little higher. We don't want that. We want it to be a facilitator. So where there's large companies that this term efficient infringement has kind of come through, they have that market monopoly that they can simply infringe and then pay the penalty later, versus immediately take out a license and facilitate that partnership. That's not a great trend. On the other side, I think I mentioned over-aggressive antitrust activity, which I think is easy to do. And you hear some of the rhetoric coming out of Washington about aggressive antitrust enforcement. I think you don't want to hush a lot of great activity that could happen in collaboration. So, again, it always has been a balance. It's been a balance on antitrust enforcement. It's been a balance on IP versus antitrust. So I think a conversation that's going to continue, and the administration certainly has been focused on that a bit. But there's a host of other issues. Immigration. The last administration did not, I think, take a good approach on immigration. Personally, I think certainly it starts with H-1B visas and making sure that you get the talent here to help fund the startups with the talent. That's more international than just U.S. based. I think that's important. There was a study from the National Venture Capital Association recently that said 1/3 of all U.S. venture-backed companies that went public between 2006 and 2012 had at least one immigrant founder. I mean, I think that's telling. So having rational policy that both allow the talent to come in and allow the startups to thrive, I think is very, very important. Jared, you mentioned taxes and tax policy. Clearly that's important. I think there's a way to over manipulate tax policy. We don't want to do that, but certainly that's going to be critically important for companies to thrive. And then I'll focus on the last one, which I think is frankly, there was a lot of attention coming out in the last administration on diversity, and it's not just diversity of people. From my perspective, diversity of people at the PTO, but also diversity of people using the patent system, and actually recognizing that they need to protect their innovations early on. I think there's a great disparity. There's lots of great data that's out there that show who's accessing the system, both on race and on gender. I think that's there's just before the last administration left town, there was a commission created at the USPTO to continue to look at this issue. There was legislation introduced just within the last few weeks, directing the USPTO to voluntarily collect more information so we can get a better picture of who's using the system. So I think both on the administration side, within the administration, I think having diverse populations that reflect our society is very important. But the untapped potential, if you only have a certain part of the innovative community actually accessing the IP system, is a crime. And really, we should be all doing what we can in terms of public policy to not just educate but enable, to bring more of our innovation community to the table, to know the tools that they can use to be successful. And that's going to take work on behalf of all of us. To kind of change the system and to change kind of the implicit bias, no intention or not, implicit bias to help the people that are close to you versus really diversifying the group of innovators that are out there. So I think this is a great issue for the administration to focus more time on. I think they already are doing that. I think that should be part of the Build Back Better plan. I think it will be. So that's the other thing that I hit on. The only thing that neither I think Jared, you or I hit on is what does China trade and foreign policy look like? But I think that's got to be part of it. I think at least on the IP side, there's a lot of resetting of our trade policies that we can do to make sure that we're protecting IP and enabling IP. I think particularly as it relates to US versus China, I think there's lots of conversations to be had as well.
Agreed.
Thank you. So moving from the, let's say, the regulatory more to the politics, like domestic politics on international politics. There has been a few examples lately on this overlap, between innovation on startup community with politics on geopolitics. So one example is Twitter, for instance, cutting a number of accounts. Other examples are, for instance, the detention of the daughter of the UI founder in Canada. There are a number of things that happen also in Europe, with fines applied to big tech, primarily for what you were mentioning around their tax policy on tax localization. Do you see that happening more and more? I mean, we are also in a situation where government on countries are competing against each other, to attract talent, to make their startup ecosystems thrive. Do you see this kind of instruments coming up on increasing, or do you think it's more something that was a hype and is probably going to calm down?
Yeah, as some have called it, the full-blown cold tech war. It's like,
yeah.
I mean, I think, I'd be really curious, given Dana's position in in DC and his policy work, what he thinks on it. At least from everyone I talk to, a lot of folks seem to think that because President Biden does have a more multilateral approach, that at least a better tone will be set. But one observation that's been made is, for all of President Trump's behavior with respect to these various countries, President Biden never really criticized him much on the economic side. And so there is some wonder just how much, in terms of true hard policy, the Biden administration is going to come away from that, particularly with respect to China, things like that. I mean, it's interesting, the Shanghai Stock Exchange has now eclipsed the NASDAQ in terms of a number of Chinese startups on it. And so, many are saying, while the approach will be softer and more conciliatory and more friendly, the actual policy could still continue. I think on the EU side, because the relationships that President Biden has with the leaders in Europe is so strong, and a lot of these issues that have been going on between the EU and the United States have been more on the enforcement side than actual laws. And so I think because of those relationships, you might get a softening up. It's very difficult to predict at this point, but that's really the tea leaves that I and some of the people I've talked to have been seeing. Dan, I'd love to get your take on it, given where you are. It's a tough issue.
Yeah, no, I don't have much to actually add. I think you're exactly right. I think the tone will be similar. I don't think you'll see dramatic departures on economic policy. Except with the caveats that you and I just mentioned, which is, using economic policy to further diversity, to kind of direct investment, to do those things, certainly. But between the relations with the countries, I'm not sure there will be much, but I guess we'll see. That certainly be part of the Build Back Better. What you take away from we're in recovery from the Trump administration is just reestablishing good relationships and doing it in a way that's more transparent and not gotcha and not the art of the deal, which I think the president was trying to portray, but maybe not as successfully. So yeah, I think that's not a bad thing that we don't see dramatic changes in economic policy if that's the case, but certainly kind of improving opportunities for communication and transparency are better.
Okay, very good. So we have about 10 minutes left. I suggest we spend about 5 minutes on, you see time is running. We spend about 5 minutes on ESG, and then maybe we give 5 minutes for questions. If you have questions, feel free to ask in the Q&A. So we have already a few questions we'll try to answer. But yeah, let's speak briefly about ESG. So obviously it's been an up-and-coming topic for now a few years, building up. Initially, lots of greenwashing and people talking a lot, not doing much. On a few people doing a lot early stage, but now it's been really scaling significantly. How do you see that affecting the startup agenda? Right now, when you look actually at any startup, they're here to save the planet, right? That was actually in the Silicon Valley already the case for a long time. But now you have to have your ESG agenda. On a lot of startups, I see, for instance, in fashion, everything is not upcycled. You can't basically create a company that would not integrate these points. How do you see that in your environment? How are investors selecting projects? How are funders actually integrating these parameters?
Yeah, we see it in a couple of places. Number one, it's funny, a joke I've been making lately is that as CEO of a startup, you're really the chief storyteller, because narrative is becoming so important for some of these startups, because everything's being mission oriented nowadays, and there's a enhanced focus on the entire stakeholder universe, not just stockholders. So, one thing we're seeing is the rise of benefit corporations. You're seeing a number of companies. There was one company a year or two ago that converted into a B Corp to go public. So you're starting to see more where people have a realization that it's the entire universe of stakeholders and not just stockholder returns that are important. In terms of the investment community, understand the driver for the startup should be twofold. Number one, right now, and I have the data somewhere here, if you gave me 5 minutes while Dan is talking, maybe I'll pull it up. A full third of the capital available in the United States to invest, just period, is actually subject to what we call SRIs, socially responsible investment policies. And so those can fit a whole bunch of criteria. It goes into climate change, environmental awareness. It goes into diversity, DE&I. It goes into sustainability. But in one shape or form, a full 1/3 of all capital that is available to be deployed in the United States via alternative investment routes is subject to SRI of some sort. Number two, increasingly on the public capital markets, what we call the proxy advisory firms, the firms that advise as to how you vote. You get your proxy vote for a board of directors slate. There are proxy advisory firms, ISS, Glass Lewis, et cetera, who advise stockholders how they think they should vote. And increasingly, they have taken the position that by the end of this year, if not the beginning of 2022, if a company does not do better in ESG, particularly on the diversity side, they will start recommending votes against the board slate. And so why does that matter to a startup? Well, the problem is when you're being invested in or acquired by a fund, they're thinking of your exit. Well, the exit can only come in one of two forms. They either sell you to someone else or they take you public. And they're going to sell you to someone else. That person may be thinking of taking you public. And so the public capital markets tend to drive how startup behavior should be. So the combination of the fact that a full third of the capital available to be deployed into you, that's more of a direct concern, is already subject to SRI. And the fact that in the public capital markets, there's a number of drivers driving the public capital markets towards ESG. The combination there is really pushing startups to do it. You just have to have it as part of your plan at this point. And the tricky part with startups that we always warn them is, there's a temptation with probably 80% of the companies in America, not just startups, including many big ones, to simply have the policy or to have the disclosure or to say we're committed to ESG, the following policies. But then when you drill down and say, well, can you measure this? Can you show us this commitment? They all fail. And you want to be careful with that because it actually costs credibility for a C-suite a great deal. And they're starting to get caught more and more. More and more of these sophisticated investors, the Vanguards of the world, the State Streets of the world, the BlackRocks of the world, are starting to drill down even deeper and say, okay, it's wonderful you say you're committed to ESG. How about we do a quick ESG audit and see how you do? And they're seeing, you sort of see this look of fear in the C-suite when that comes up. So if you're going to do ESG policies, which by all means you should also make sure that substantively you're really doing it. It's measurable. You've got someone on your executive team that's tasked with making sure it gets done, things like that. It's sort of like compliance plans. When compliance plans first started coming out in the 80s and 90s, people would just sort of fake it, if you will. And they were tagged by the authorities a great deal, saying, well, this isn't a true compliance plan. Therefore, we're not going to give you the liability protection that a compliance plan normally gives you, and we're going to prosecute. And so now you see with compliance plans, those of you who've worked ever for a large company or even a smaller company, it's much more robust. It's the same thing with ESG policies.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I don't have too much to add. Jared, I love the CEO as a chief storyteller. I think that's absolutely true. It's absolutely true as companies are getting more global, becoming more global brands, and you're really trying to market yourself kind of throughout the world. But it also makes good business sense. I think consumers understand and want to know more than they ever did where it comes from, how it's made, what precautions they took to make sure that the air I'm breathing is cleaner, as one example. So I think all of that makes really, really good business sense, in addition to the good corporate citizen approach as well. So I don't have too much to add to that, but I'm happy to kind of move on to questions here, because our time is starting to run out.
No, absolutely. I think also point on that is that the customer base of startup is also a lot on the Gen Y. And these guys have a value that have shifted significantly compared to boomers and so on. So somehow they have to align with that. And somehow they're also part of this generation, a lot of funders.
That's
so
right.
it comes together. But obviously there is a goodwill on this objective to change the world, to build a better world and so on. But obviously in the background is also some commercial.
But I do think, I think you're right. I think you picked up that is exactly what I was pointing to. I think there's some good studies from INTA, the International Trademark Association, in the last few years that talk about by generation brand loyalty. And kind of what they see in a brand and whether it represents their lifestyle. And I think all that is much more important than it even was in my parents' time.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So let's take a question. We have 3 minutes, more or less. So the first question from Douglas Andrew: at what stage does a new venture has to become at what stage does a new venture have to become a SPAC target? So what criteria does they need to reach?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So the economics of SPACs is such that we typically tell people you want the value of your company to be about 2 to 3 times whatever amount of capital the SPAC has in it. Part of when a SPAC goes public, the sponsors infuse it with capital. And so to make sense, given how the economics work, your value of your company should be about 2 to 3 times the size, maybe 4 times. So then it depends on what size SPAC you're looking at. So as you can infer from that, this is on the larger side as a tactic. Direct listings are done for smaller companies, things like that. But as you start to scale and you become large enough, you can become eligible for that. If you're talking stage, this is a later stage tactic. I mean, typically think about your exit, your ultimate exit when you sell to a strategic or a financial buyer, or you did an IPO. It's the exact same thing. It's at that latest stage in your matriculation.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. On another question from Eugene Mayer or Major, I don't know how you say it. Do you know of funding for new biotech therapeutics in the new Biden funding program? So the kind of package they want to launch.
Sure. The answer is not specifically because the program doesn't exist yet. This is them. They're supposed to hold a joint session of Congress where they sort of launch this whole thing. This is them just sort of outline in broad strokes. It's almost like he's still campaigning, which is typical. But you know what's expected is there will be a more robust and specific package that gets out there, especially given COVID and given our realization of how fragile we are as a species. I'd be shocked if there wasn't some specific funding for biotherapeutics in there. What that looks like, I'm not sure anyone knows yet.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing. I said, you know, it's really unclear. I mean, I think consistent with the conversation we had earlier, what you will see is, you know, certainly some innovations come out of NIH funding, right? There's ways of getting funding there. Certainly, there's a lot of university therapies that might be developed and moved into the marketplace, and our BIDOL infrastructure helps us do that. You know, in terms of direct funding on research and development, I would imagine very little. I would, in terms of getting those to a final stage and actually getting delivered, lots of funding on the infrastructure to make sure that these things are facilitated in a speedy way. I mean, I think the biggest challenges, right, are the regulatory authorities to make sure that there's safety and health and safety, right? So getting through the FDA and having those conversations kind of early and streamlined clearly are all very, very important. But I think that's probably the form that it'll come in versus you know, dollars directly to companies, but maybe there'll be some of that too. I think the other I think great thing that we're seeing is a lot of again, a lot of companies creating partnerships where they might not have before with direct competitors, simply to you know, increase their bandwidth or complement the resources that they have. So you know, some encouragement there. And again, maybe going back to the taxes, maybe there's something to do there that makes it more attractive to find a different dancing partner that can make you more effective, I think is good.
Yeah. So thank you very much. It was very, very interesting conversation. I found it really fascinating.
Just sorry to interrupt, Luc. I think we have another question from Martin.
Yeah. Okay, if you have time, because we are at the top of the hour, but if you have time, we can take this last one. The question is your view on how the Fed's very loose monetary policy in response to COVID-19 influences the US venture community.
Jared may have a better perspective on that. I don't know.
Interesting question. I haven't even really thought about it too much. It's an interesting question. I'm trying to formulate an answer on the quick. I mean, I honestly, knowing venture as I do, it really comes down to the fact that you've got $1 trillion of undeployed capital. I mean, it's like, I hate to oversimplify it, but that really is what it is, and they're going to have to return it. I mean, I think I'm not sure. I'd have to mull over the monetary policy impact on it, because I think the fact that I've never thought about it means it's not that it'll be agnostic, but I don't think it's going to have a massive impact on it, just knowing how venture is structured.
Yeah. But I think it's, again, what you were mentioning initially, you know, with the dry powder and so on. There is a lot of cash right now in the system. And I think it's really going to continue funding things. And to some extent, it's good. To some extent, you also need some form of selection, you know, from the VC typically. And if you have too much cash, somehow you might also fund projects that might not be necessarily successful. And, you know, the startup ecosystem has been growing massively, partially because of lots of cash on the low interest rates, or actually not so many investment opportunities elsewhere. So that's why private equities thrive, VCs thrive. And yeah, to some extent it's good because it's been creating this ecosystem, but to some extent it creates success stories, but also a lot of companies that kind of go nowhere. So yeah, is that good or bad? I don't know.
Well, thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time on really fascinating conversation. You know, I listen to a lot of panels. I go to the World Economic Forum, for instance, and I found this panel really very insightful. On the level was really extremely good. So thank you very much, and looking forward to talk to you soon. And have a great end of day, evening, morning, or wherever you are.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, guys.